Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
This is always the most difficult meeting because the blood is going from our head to our stomach. Now, I do have, on occasion, I've been known to have a habit where if I see somebody kind of going, that if I know their name, Caden, with a K, I might yell out your name. Or if I see somebody nearby that I know their name and I don't know yours, I'll just say, would you just give that person a little elbow? So Caden, would you help me out with that, buddy? All right. Caden and I, we're a team now. We're a team. Brother Garnett asked me, Sue asked me, I think that was it, about Edward and Africa and about writing another book, and I just wanted to give you a brief update where we are with that. We do have another book. It will be coming out probably within a month. My friend in Ramona, Kirk, has been editing the book. What it's about is, it's 22 chapters. It's basically the same size. It'll be the same size of The Secret Terrorist Enemy Unmasked, about 150, 160 pages. What it is that over the years, people at my church in Florida, because every Sabbath I'll tell them a story from Edward over in Zambia. And they've said, Bill, you've got to put these into a book. And I said, I really don't want to. And it's not because I don't love the stories. I love them too. But it's too much. It's too much. And I like to think that I just have all this energy and I can just keep right on zooming. Well, I've got to maintain health. And so I'm really careful about my sleeping, my diet, to try to keep it as simple as possible. My exercising, when I'm home, I usually get on a stationary bike and an elliptical for about 5 to 6 miles every time I do it, just to get my heart circulating, my blood flowing, and sweat. I love to sweat, I just do, because I know how good it makes me feel. When I get done, if I've had a stressful day and I get on that elliptical or on the stationary bike, when I get done, I want to go to sleep. It's just so relaxing. And so folk, maintaining my health is extremely important to me. Well, some folk about 2.5 months ago at church, they said, Bill, you got to write another book and you got to do it on Edward's stories. I said, I don't have time. Well, the following week I went up to Carolina to speak, and I started speaking Thursday night, and Friday morning a little voice said to me, Bill, you have 8 hours today until your first meeting tonight, Friday evening. You don't have time? Well, I couldn't say no to that, because I did. Well, by the time my meeting started that evening, I had 2 chapters done. What I've done is I've taken Edward's stories about the radio programs and the evangelistic work that he and I have been doing together now for about 10 years. And I took the stories and put them into the book. And then what I did was, for example, the first radio station that we worked with, the man's name was Gordon Brown. He was, as Edward calls him, and it's really cute to me, but Edward said, Pastor Bill, he is a white Anglican from South Africa. I said, okay, great, who cares? I mean, but Mr. Brown was raised believing that the book of Revelation was a sealed book. Nobody can understand it. It's just put in there, but we don't know why. It's just there. Well, when we put onto his radio station the series on the book of Revelation, he was floored. He was floored. And he contacted all his family and friends in South Africa, and he said, you've got to listen to this. This is truth that we've never heard before. And so as I tell the story of Mr. Brown, Mr. Gordon Brown, once I tell his personal experience with the messages, then I go into detail and explain what it was that he was learning from the book of Revelation. And then when we talk about the Jesuit Agenda series, well then I take a break from the person who we're talking about, and I explain the Jesuit Agenda and what their goals are for the world. So I love the book. It has beautiful stories from, I think I figured out, there's at least 15 different African nations that have been touched by the radio programs and the evangelistic outreach. So we're looking at Tanzania and Kenya and South Africa and Swaziland and Botswana and Zimbabwe, Malawi, Congo, Rwanda, Eritrea, Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. So there's at least 15 different countries. And so we put those into a book. What I love about it is that it contains every aspect of the three angels' messages. It looks at the commandments of God. It looks at man's inability to keep those commandments. It reveals Christ as the only way whereby a fallen human being can obey. It looks at, of course, the Sabbath as a sign of God's creative, redeeming power. It looks at the sanctuary. Of course, it talks about apostasy within apostate Protestant churches, and it also looks at apostasy within Adventist churches. Because through the radio programs, the two groups that have been most vociferous against the radio programs are Roman Catholics and Seventh-day Adventists, Gene. You got it, Gene? Yeah. So it looks at those things. There's a chapter in there about, are you a good or a bad Seventh-day Adventist, based on the testimony of a cardinal on the national TV station in Zambia. It talks about the Catholic priest who died for his faith. It talks about a man who was a Muslim who lost his wife and daughter to Ethiopian soldiers because they were having a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and how this man was determined to become a suicide bomber, a suicide Muslim bomber terrorist, and how he was in a hospital room and a guy gave him a little radio and he tuned it in. He heard a message about the love of Jesus. That only Christ can take a heart that's been broken by tragedy and pain and can bring it peace. And the man's life was transformed. You know, praise God. Praise God. He spoke to this man. It's dramatic. It's dramatic. So The last chapter of the book, it's called the Elijah Message. It looks at the Elijah that spoke on Mount Carmel, who exalted Jesus and the Ten Commandments, who demanded more than lip service Christianity and pointed people back to the sanctuary. And then, talk in there that there's a lot of people today that want to remain straddling a fence. They want one leg in the world and they want one leg in the church. And God, through the Elijah Message, is in the process of clearing the fence. Amen. And as He clears it, we either end up on one side or the other. But there won't be any more fence straddling when the Elijah Message is given. That's just the nature, it's the nature of the message. So, when it's given, people are forced to make decisions. They're forced to. They either love the message or they hate it. And so, all the stories in the book look at people who they chose to follow the truth of God, and in doing that, they were ostracized by family. One couple from, where was it? I think it was Rwanda. They were both Muslims. They became Seventh-day Adventist Christians. And as a result, the man's family, they were going to kill him. And so the man was forced to flee from their home. Otherwise, they'd be killed. So, all the stories, as you guys, those of you that get my newsletter, the stories, they grip you because these are people who are making decisions that cost them something. Amen. Yeah. And for those of us in America, I know the other night at Chuck and Jeannie's, Dan was sharing his testimony with us. For Dan to become a Seventh-day Adventist and to marry Nettie, it cost him something. And it still is costing him something today. But he's here because he loves the Lord and His truth and his wife more than anything in the world. Amen. So that's the beauty of the stories. The book is called Three Angels Over Africa. And once I get them, I'm hoping within a month, we'll ship some out to Countryside Sabbath Fellowship. Edward just wrote to me the other day about two gentlemen that were planning to enter the Catholic seminary there in, I think it was Zambia. And they got a hold of they started listening to our radio programs, and God used them to call them to make a decision, and they chose to forsake going to a Catholic seminary, and now they're studying to become Seventh-day Adventist evangelists. Amen. So, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God is amazing.
Yes, He is.
He is amazing.
Yes, He is.
Truly. Well, we're going to look this afternoon, World War III, planning ahead. Planning ahead. Let's take a look and see what it says. World War III, I thought there's only been two. Well, there's another one planned. And the first two have been so scripted. Once we get around to World War III, I think the guy who wrote it deserves our attention. You'll see it in a few minutes. Great Controversy, page 565 and 566. Romanism as a system is no more in harmony with the gospel of Christ now than at any former period in her history. Boy, that's an explosion, isn't it? That's enough to get yourself killed in about any major city in America. Rome isn't any different, folk, than it was in the Dark Ages. It's just she's being held at bay right now. The Protestant churches are in great darkness, and we could include Protestant and Seventh-day Adventist churches are in great darkness so they would discern the signs of the times. Folk, as we noticed this morning in Sabbath school with Waco and the uniting together of all churches, there's just a great ecumenical, well, it's an ecumenical party. That's what's going on. All the churches of the world are joining together. That includes Seventh-day Adventists. All of them are. The Roman Church is far-reaching in her plans and modes of operation. She is employing every device to extend her influence and increase her power in preparation for a fierce and determined conflict to regain control of the world, to reestablish persecution, and to undo all that Protestantism has done. Catholicism is gaining ground upon every side. You know, folk, Rome knows. They know what they're about. They know what their plan is to take over. They've already taken over all the churches. John Paul made it clear in that statement this morning, the challenge of the sects, that now Rome's focus is on those new religious groups in America that are still promoting the three angels' messages. That's who they're going after now. Self-supporting ministries. That's why in self-supporting ministries, you have people that have come into self-supporting ministries and they become sidetracked. They become possessed with ideas like, oh, you got to keep the feast days. Or, oh, you got to call God a certain name. Or, oh, the church is Babylon. Or, oh, you've got to stay in the church. Or, Jesus died on a Wednesday. Or, the Holy Spirit is not a person. You know, and it goes on and on and on. Distraction. Sidestepping the real issue. Will I submit myself to Christ so that His law can be seen in my life, and will I share that with the world? That's our whole purpose, folk. But the devil thinks of 1,000 distractions to get us away from that experience and then sharing it with the world. But folk, if there's a group of people that will get serious about this message, it's going to go. It's going to go, friends. It's going to go. Now, the Roman Church is far-reaching in her plans and modes of operation. How far-reaching? What did we read this morning in the sermon? That Augustine B., the Jesuit cardinal, when Alberto Rivera was in the Jesuit seminary, he told him, Rome has wanted Jerusalem for the last 1,700 years. Far-reaching? Yeah. They look way down the road and say, this is what we're going to accomplish. They know what they're about, friends. The big question is, when will we know beyond a shadow of a doubt what we're about? When will we finally get it? The Jesuit order plans years, decades, centuries ahead in order to bring their plans to fruition. They want to undo all that Protestantism has done. Catholicism is gaining ground upon every side. Well, my, is that happening? How ridiculous. The guy that's going to become the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he was going before the Senate this week. He was in charge of the CIA, which is the Catholic Intelligence Agency. I'm sure he's a Roman Catholic himself. And now he's going to be the Secretary, probably the Secretary of State of the United States. You got Donald Trump, the President of the United States, trained at Fordham University, one of the top 3 or 4 Jesuit institutions in America. You've got 6 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices. 6 of 9 are Roman Catholics. 2 of the other 3 are members of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a Jesuit front organization.
Infiltration.
Folk, they're gaining ground on every side. Yes, they are. Now, this is a quote. It's taken from a book by Des Griffin called Descent into Slavery, pages 38 and 39. Now, this is not talking about the history of slavery from Africa to the New World. This is talking about a completely different kind of slavery. Notice what he says. In the decades that followed, it became apparent that in order to achieve their goal of world domination. Now, Des Griffin, in his book, he is not a Christian or a Bible-believing person. He refers to it as the Illuminati. But if you study into the Illuminati, it's very clear that the Illuminati were a front for the Jesuit order. Adam Weishaupt was teaching canon law at Ingolstadt University in Bavaria. Canon law is Roman Catholic law. Ingolstadt was the preeminent Jesuit university. He was teaching in Bavaria, which was a Jesuit stronghold throughout the centuries, even after Luther's Reformation. Bavaria was always controlled by Rome, always. That's where Weishaupt was when he started the Illuminati. So the Illuminati is simply a Jesuit front. So Griffin says they would have to instigate of the old world order in preparation for the construction of the new world order. Folk, there is no new world order. It's simply the revival of the old world order. That's all it is. The old world order was Rome, Rome, and Rome. That's what the old world order was. They controlled the planet during the Dark Ages. The new world order is simply the revival of the old. That's all it is. And if we miss that in understanding current events, history, Bible prophecy, then we've missed the boat. You know, it's like talking to a history teacher who teaches about all the Louis in France and all the Victorias in England and all the Edwards in England and all the Kaisers in Germany and leaves out the papacy. You've left out the main ingredient. That's like cooking, chicken soup and forgetting the chicken. It just doesn't work. Doesn't work. The plan was outlined. Now, this was the plan to reconstruct, as Des Griffin says, the New World Order. The plan was outlined in graphic detail by Albert Pike, the sovereign Grand Commander of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and the top Illuminist in America, in a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini dated August 15, 1871. Now, Albert Pike, Grand Commander of Freemasonry, the top Illuminist in America, because of the close relationship between the Illuminati and the Jesuits, Albert Pike was the top Jesuit in America in the 19th century. And Albert Pike also was a general in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He was a real dud, but he was a brilliant dud. Albert Pike wrote a letter, August 15, 1871. This is what he said. He stated there would be a First World War. It was to be fomented in order to destroy Tsarist Russia and to place that vast land under the direct control of Illuminati agents. Russia was then to be used as a boogeyman to further the aims of the Illuminati worldwide. Now, what happened during World War I? Do you remember a king that died during World War I? He and his wife, Alexandra, and all of their children. All were daughters except that one little boy who was a hemophiliac. You remember that story? Because Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, had started listening to a Jesuit sorcerer by the name of Rasputin. And he carried that woman, just took her along by the nose because Rasputin said, "Oh, with my powers I will heal your son." Of course, he never did. But by the time Alexandra realized it was a hoax, she was staring in front of a mob and staring in front of a rifle when all of her family were slaughtered. And the Romanov dynasty of Russia was no more. It disappeared right during the First World War. Interesting. And Albert Pike said that would happen 46 years before it happened. You say, well, he must have been a prophet then. No, he wasn't a prophet, folk, at all. He was a demon-possessed man, but in their councils with high-ranking demons, they determined that they would create a world in which they could have war. And that's exactly what they did. And as a result of the destruction of the Romanov dynasty in Russia, the Romanov dynasty was replaced by men like Nikolai Lenin and Joseph Stalin. And those men, now Des Griffin calls them Illuminati agents. They were trained by the Jesuits. They were trained by the Jesuits to destroy Orthodox Christians in Russia, Bible-believing Christians in Russia, and that's exactly what they did. Through the scourges in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, Stalin killed, 40 million people in Russia? World War II was to be fomented through manipulation of the differences that existed between the German nationalists and the political Zionists. Well, let's look at that for a minute. Who was that nation in World War II that had that guy with that funny little mustache underneath his nose? What country was that? It was Germany, wasn't it? And Albert Pike said World War II would be brought on by differences between Germany and political Zionists. Now, Zionists are Jews. Political Zionists are any nation that supports Israel. Well, the political Zionists of the 20th century would be the United States, Great Britain, France. Isn't it interesting that World War II was predominantly a war between Germany America, Britain, and France. Now, of course, Japan was in there and other nations, but they were the big boys. And that's exactly what Albert Pike said. This was to result, World War II would result in an expansion of Russian influence and the establishment of a state of Israel in Palestine. Now let me ask you something. Before World War II, what was Russian name? What was their name? Come on, that's easy. It was Russia. See, I told you it was easy. After World War II, what was it called? The USSR. Why was it called the USSR? Because Russia had expanded. It wasn't now just about that great big mass in East Asia. No, now it was about all those satellite countries, Estonia and Latvia and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and all those other stans right in that area.
15 republics.
What's that?
15 republics.
15 republics. Yeah, after World War II, Russia expanded, folk, and became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's exactly what Albert Pike said. Now, when I used to play sports, if I went up to the plate and the first time up I got a double or a triple, and the second time up I got a home run, and I was 2 for 2, you know, the next time I went up to the plate, the pitcher knew exactly who I was, and he was going to change how he was going to pitch to me. Why? Because he didn't want me to do that to him again. So I had his attention. In fact, I remember one game, amazing. I'd never done that in my life before or since, but I hit a few home runs in the game. The next time up, the pitcher threw the ball square right at my ribs. I blocked it with my arm and had a great big, swollen elbow for about a week. Point being, folk, when you are batting a very high percentage, the other team knows you exist. And they're eyeing you. Albert Pike's 2 for 2 now. He said exactly what would occur after World War I, and it did. And he said exactly what would happen at the end of World War II, and it did. I think we need to listen to him. He also said that not only would Russia expand their influence, he also said the state of Israel would be established in Palestine. Now, folk, that happened in 1948. He said that in 1871. That's 29 and 48. That's 77 years. The Jesuits are far-reaching in their plans and modes of operation. They are, aren't they? Yeah. So Albert Pike has laid out the exact plan for a new world order. 2 wars, but he didn't stop there. The Third World War. Here's number 3 now. We haven't seen that. Let's see what he says. Let's see if we can decipher what Rome is planning for the world in light of God's plan within the great controversy. The Third World War was planned to result from differences stirred up by Illuminati agents between the Zionists and the Arabs. Now again, remembering, Des Griffin does not understand the rule of Rome or the Jesuits. That's what he's talking about. Rome is behind this, friends. And it says it would be stirred up between differences between the Arab world and the Zionists. Now again, you remember, a Zionist is either a Jew or a nation that is pro-Israel. America, England, France, and America's allies. Well, that's interesting. What just happened last night? What just happened? Somebody tell me. Interestingly enough, who were the main players in what happened last night? Were there any Arabs involved? Oh, you bet there were. Because Syria was bombed. They're Arabs, aren't they? Last time I checked. Are the Arabs involved in what's going on? You bet they are. How about who was it that attacked them? Who bombed them? It was Zionists. America, England, France. Now, what we were told in the press this week was, and we saw those pictures, of those little children trying to breathe and, just in a lot of pain. To try to trigger in us sadness. And to say, oh, how pitiful, how terrible that these children are being mistreated like that. Friend, it was only to justify bombing. That's all it was. Anything to create war. Anything. Zionists, Arabs. The conflict, Pike said, was planned to spread worldwide. Now, am I telling you that we're going to have a worldwide war? Folk, if God wills it, if this is heaven's time, if this is heaven's hour, yeah, we will. We will. That's exactly what Pike is saying. We'll see if this is the Lord's time. The Jesuits planned to unleash the nihilists and atheists and provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization. And then Albert Pike throws in, it's very interesting. He says that the citizens of the world will now be ready to receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view. Now remember, folk, Albert Pike's been right twice. So what does all this mean? What does all that mean? Well, it's going to get ugly if the Lord wills it and says, okay, it's time. Somewhere in the midst of this final battle, this false Armageddon, Albert Pike said the world will be ready to receive the true light of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view. What in the world is that? From creation, from the fall of Adam and Eve, what has engulfed the worship of humanity since the Garden of Eden? What has it been, folk? Think about it. What do people worship in the visible universe as that one thing that is more powerful than anything else. What is it? It's the sun. Sheldon, it's the sun. Folk, the pure doctrine of Lucifer, the ultimate doctrine of Lucifer is sun worship. That's what it is. It's a belief that man, independent of the power of God, can save themselves in sin. That's what it is. And that ultimately is what sun worship or Sunday is all about. It's that I can live a life separate from Jesus Christ. I can choose a life of sin, and I can save myself. That's what sun worship is. And that's the pure doctrine of Lucifer. So according to Albert Pike, within the teeth of this Third World War, there will be a Sunday law. And if time is right, folks, and this is the Lord's time, you and I could see a Sunday law within this battle that is beginning in the Middle East. Now, I want you to hear me clearly, because I've had people say, "Oh, well, Bill Hughes is saying there's going to be a third war." Oh, there is going to be. Folk, when it comes to time, we need to be careful. Back in 1980, in my final year of college, my favorite teacher, one day he said, "Gentlemen, ask me any question you want." Somebody raised their hand and said, "Elder Gain, when is Jesus going to come?" 1980. He looked at us and he said, "Gentlemen, 5 years." That was 38 years ago, folk. We don't control time. God controls time. Will there be a war? Yes, there will be a war. And I believe, based on what Albert Pike said, that within that time of war, there will be a Sunday law. I believe that with all my heart, based on this information and what we understand in the great controversy. The time frame, maybe it's now, maybe that war will escalate, and maybe it won't. Let's watch and see. And while we're watching and seeing, let's be spending time at Jesus' feet,
Amen.
listening to His words, and surrendering our lives to His will and to His authority. Isn't he a beauty? Just the kind of guy, ladies, you'd want your daughter to go out with, wouldn't it be? I know, Lisa, I agree. That was Albert Pike. A demon-possessed, horrible man. He was the top Freemason. By the time of Pike, the Masons were completely taken over by the Jesuits. The Illuminati had always been a Jesuit front. Pike worked in the inner circles of the Jesuit order and knew what was being planned. He pinned it to this man, Giuseppe Mazzini. When he wrote that letter to Mazzini in 1871, Ulysses S. Grant was president. The Civil War had just ended. James White would die 9 years later. The early Adventist Church had yet to send out its first foreign missionary. J. N. Andrews didn't go out till 1874. The final spike had just been nailed down to complete the first transcontinental railroad across the United States. When Pike speaks of 3 wars that have been planned, He's revealing Rome's plan for the world. As far back as 1871, the Jesuit order had planned the wars of the 20th century and maybe this current war. How we've been lied to. How we've been lied to. It wasn't the shooting of the Archduke of Austria that brought World War I. It wasn't Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini that brought World War II. It wasn't weapons of mass destruction of Saddam Hussein or the tear gas of Syria that's causing conflict over there. Those are lies, friends. These wars have been on the Jesuit chalkboard for over 130 years. To them and them alone is the responsibility for these horrors. The visible leaders that are paraded before the world are mere puppets whose strings are being pulled by their masters. And that includes the President of the United States. He's a puppet. He's doing what he's told to do by his masters. Pike stated the First World War was to be fomented to destroy Tsarist Russia, to place that land under the direct control of Illuminati agents. Russia was then to be used as a boogeyman to further the aims of the Illuminati worldwide. The animal growls. It's exactly what happened. There's the family of Nicholas and Alexandria. Right there. 1917 for a family photo with their little boy, the hemophiliac. And they were all gunned down, and that ended the Romanov dynasty. Albert Pike said that would happen. The reason why Rome wanted the destruction of the Romanov dynasty was because it was some of Nicholas's father and grandfather who had passed decrees in Russia giving the Russian people a constitution. A constitution. In Robert Thompson's book, The Footprints of the Jesuits, page 245 and 246, it says the Russian emperor Alexander was currently compelled to issue a royal decree in 1816 by which he expelled the Jesuits from St. Petersburg and Moscow. This proving ineffectually issued another in 1820 excluding them entirely from Russian dominions. Alexander too had progressed well with his great reforms, had attached his signature to a constitution to be adopted by Russia. This same Tsar who had the audacity to bring a constitution to the Russian people also did something else for which the Jesuits would not forgive him. At the height of the Civil War, when the balance of the war could go either way, Alexander II came to the aid of Abraham Lincoln. That is an unknown fact of history, folk, that Russia, during the Civil War, when it looked like the North were going to fall to the Confederates, Alexander II sent a fleet of ships to America, and the Confederacy backed away. By driving the Jesuits from Russia, refusing to establish a central bank, planning a constitution, aiding the North during the Civil War, the czars of Russia had incurred the undying wrath of the Jesuit order. Payback was imminent. The other no-no of the czars was their protection of the Russian Orthodox Church, the implacable enemy of Rome for over 1,000 years. These were the reasons why the Romanovs had to go. Nicholas had to be killed. The overthrow of the Tsarist system therefore brought with it the inevitable overthrow of the Orthodox Church. To the Vatican, which had waged war against the Orthodox Church since the 11th century, the downfall of her millenarian rival was too good to be true. So who benefited when that bullet went through Nicholas's brain? Rome benefited. Rome benefited. Because the Russian Constitution would go. The Orthodox Church would go. And so would the hated Romanov rulers. World War II. The German nationalists, the political Zionists. Russia would expand, a state would be established in Palestine for Israel. You know, folk, in reading history, in looking at current events, if we look at the people on the outside, we are missing the entire picture. It's like if you go to Mount Carmel. Everybody was at Mount Carmel. You've got Ahab, you've got the Baal prophets, you've got the prophets of the grove, you've got the apostate Adventists, and you've got the 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, and you've got that faithful man in the midst of all of this circus. But folk, there was somebody missing at Mount Carmel. And that person that was missing was the instigator and the one behind that entire scene. But wasn't there. Wasn't there. Who wasn't on Mount Carmel? Jezebel. And Jezebel was pulling Ahab's strings. She was pulling the Baal prophet strings. She was pulling the prophets of the grove strings. She was deluding all the apostate Adventists. And she was threatening the 7,000 who had not bowed to her. She wasn't there. But her hand was over everything on that mountain. It's the same with history. It's the same with current events. If we read history or current events without Rome, we're missing the whole picture. We're missing the whole picture. Adolf Hitler was a puppet of the Jesuits. He was put into power by the German Nationalist Party. Franz von Papen was a top Catholic in the Nationalist Catholic Party in Germany. He got him into power. Hitler was a puppet of Rome. Leonid Trotsky was the Black Pope during that time. This man carried out Pike's plans to restore the papacy to world dominance. He had Nicholas II killed. He was behind the Holocaust. He triggered World War II. He planned the deaths of millions. There is the man responsible for World War II, friends. There is the man. Not Hitler, not Mussolini, not Churchill, not Roosevelt, not Stalin. It was him, the Black Pope. His name was, I'm not even going to try that one, but Leonid Trotsky. He was the man who pulled the strings that killed millions of people. Millions of people. If he had open heart surgery and they pulled back his bones, once they got inside, they'd realize he didn't have a heart. This man was ruthless. Ruthless. The plan for World War II, expand Russia, establish a state for the Jews in Palestine. It's exactly what happened. Russia went to Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, to Korea, ended up in the Caribbean, in Cuba. Albert Pike is batting 1,000%. 1,000%. Israel established May 14, 1948. The Jewish People's Council declared the establishment of the State of Israel following a prolonged campaign beginning in the late 19th century when the Zionist movement began working towards creating a homeland for the Jewish people. About 42% of the world's Jews live in Israel today. And you know what just boggles my mind, and I have to chuckle and sometimes smile before I kick in a door. And you're going to tell me there isn't a conspiracy? You're going to tell me that these things are not planned, that there are people pulling the strings behind the scenes? Go tell somebody else. You're not going to convince me. The evidence is overwhelming, folks. It's overwhelming. The people that tell you there isn't a conspiracy, they tell you that because they're a part of it. The Vatican believed that if all the Jews are killed, their Messiah could not come. The Vatican's aim to rule the world would remain intact. Albert Manhattan, we read it this morning. But there was a connection between the communists, the Zionists, and the Catholics. Although deliberately muted in the public press, behind the Zionist banner, there was to be found the ancient messianic hope for the coming of a global theocracy, as predicted by all the seers and prophets of Zion. It was to be a theocracy in which Jehovah, not Christ, was to be king. The specter of the creation of such a theocracy has haunted the inner chambers of the Catholic Church from her earliest inception and still is a dominant fear. In Vatican eyes, the millenarian yearning for a global Hebrew theocracy represents a deadly threat to the eschatological teachings of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, they want to rule the world, friends. And they want every single one of us to be their slaves. That's what they want. They hate the Jews. They hate Jews because the Jews also believe in a worldwide government when their Messiah finally comes. And the Catholic Church hates Jews because they're in competition. When translated into concrete political terms, such a view spells not only rivalry, but implacable enmity. Yeah, they're angry. The Third World War, Illuminati agents, Jesuits, Catholic Church, between the Zionists and the Arabs. Conflict would go all over the world, and then the pure doctrine of Lucifer would be brought out in the public view. Evangelicals have been preaching for years of a literal physical battle called Armageddon. John Hagee's one of them. This would bring in the Messiah's coming. All the world's looking for a Messiah. Great Controversy tells us the devil will come claiming to be Christ. All religions looking for a Messiah. Islam, they call him Mahdi. Buddhism, the Maitreya. The Aztecs call him the, I don't know how to say that, Quetzalcoatl. Anyway, what is it? Say it again. Quetzalcoatl. Okay. Thank you. Gracias. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. The Hindus, Javada. The Messiah, the Central Asian nomads are looking for the white Burkhan, they call it. The Christians are looking for Jesus. Everyone looks for a Messiah. And all whose names are not written in the Lamb's Book of Life will see in the devil's personating of Christ their Messiah. Of course, we read this morning the crowning act will be the devil personating Christ. But the pure doctrine of Lucifer, again, it's the worship of the sun. It's focusing on something in our creation that can save us. Albert Pike planned 3 world wars. The final war being agitated in the press right now between Jews and Arabs. Lucifer's pure doctrine would be seen. I believe that's Sunday worship. I believe if this third world war that seems to be developing, we don't know how far it's going to go. Maybe it'll stop tomorrow. But if it keeps going, when a third world war erupts and it doesn't stop, we're going to see that, folks. We're going to see Sunday. After the loud cry, the devil will appear claiming to be